Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My name is Victor Moreno. I'm a distinguished engineer with the switching team at Cisco. I've been involved in many projects, and lately I've been focused on policy and policy implications of the secure or the software-defined access. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about policy federation and what is it that we do specifically within our domains and how we're actually bringing this across a multitude of domains, not just Cisco, but across vendors actually. So to that effect, we'll talk a little bit about what it is that we mean by abstraction and identification in the policy domain. We will talk about an architecture that can accommodate this multitude of domains and what our journey is. So we're going to take this in phases, and I'll walk you through those phases, and hopefully this gives you a clear picture of what we're trying to do in the space. So as you've heard a lot about this week, it's all about intent, right? And what we mean by intent is you must be able to articulate what it is that you want to support in your infrastructure versus how you want it to be done, right? So we're providing all sorts of tools for you to actually be able to articulate the relationships between the elements that are being connected in the network, which is ultimately what you care about, right? So I'll talk about VLANs or VRFs or ACLs or anything like that. It's more about who connects to what, and that's key, right? We're building the network so that you can actually connect things to it. You can connect things to not the network, but to specific services, right? And you can actually provide those services. So those are our key tenets when we talk about policy. There are in each one of the domains different tasks and different things that need to still be done, right? So you've heard a lot about the access network and how we integrate wired and wireless. You've heard about how we actually use ICE to bring users and devices on board, right? And those are the concerns of the access network. The concerns in the data center are much different, even though it's a network and it's a switched network, and you could actually see some commonalities between that and what we do in a campus and in an access network. It's a totally different ballgame. You're looking at virtual machines, you're looking at interacting with hypervisor engines and so forth. So different tasks, basically different controllers. So what we're looking at is not the creation of an Uber controller. What we're looking at is basically maintaining these control domains. If you take the security domain, that is its own set of operational tasks as well, right? And probably its own persona to actually take care of those. So what we're looking at is basically providing a common place where you establish the intent, where you express the intent. And it has to be cross-domain. And the reason it has to be cross-domain is because you're going to have basically resources on one end, basically served by the data center, whether the data center is private or public. And the intent only makes sense in the context of who is connecting to those, right? And those are basically elements of this intent that are hosted in the different domains of the network. Furthermore, as you create the relationships between servers and users, you're going to basically describe a contract that sets the rules on how these relationships are supposed to happen. That contract is usually, it can be enforced in the infrastructure, but it can also usually will be the subject of what the security domain actually enforces, right? So you can see how this intent actually, the execution of it cuts across a multitude of domains, and even the input into the moving parts of the relationship actually come from different domains, right? So you will find that there are different policy types that we're trying to handle, right? There is an access policy, which basically defines how you're going to bring elements on board, right? This is what we do in terms of profiling, and you could argue that this is a very domain-specific task, right? You do it in one way in the data center, you do it in a different way in the access network. There's a network segmentation policy that we're going to articulate within DNA Center for software-defined access. You also do it in ACI. That basically gives you big buckets in terms of networking, right? So which virtual network am I going to put things in? There's an access control policy that defines which groups talk to which groups, right? Now, if you look at these, they are basically very group-centered, right? So I need to basically identify things with my access policy, and once I have them in groups, I'm going to start creating relationships between these, or I'm going to start putting things in buckets, which is basically the network segmentation policy. Depending on the system, you're going to see classification based on application or based on endpoint, but you're trying to identify an application and give it a specific type of treatment. You define all these three things on the right-hand side in a cross-domain manner. You don't care really which domain it is, but your intent is common, right? If something needs to be prioritized, it needs to be prioritized end-to-end. Whether one domain actually gives it a specific type of traffic engineered path, or simply says, listen, I've got so much bandwidth here that I'm going to just basically in my API say, yes, given, we're going to do that, we're going to prioritize you, but I'm really not going to do anything, right? So depending on the domain, this may be executed upon differently. Right? So just as an example of what we mean by authentication and authorization, or the access policy, you have in engines like ICE basically participate in a very rich ecosystem of relationships where you can evaluate a series of conditions, right? It's not just connecting to Active Directory and getting your credentials, but it's determining, are you wired connected, are you wireless connected, which location are you in, are you safe, right? Are you clean, right? You're going to evaluate posture. Based on all of that, you're going to distill all of this into classifying your endpoints into groups, okay? Same thing happens in the data center. So you have basically your access side where you've got something like ICE giving you the identities and you feed that into the controller. On the data center side, you do something similar. It's a much different ecosystem, right? So those access control policies are a local matter. Now, what can be made common between these is not the controller function, it's not the access control function, but what can be made common is basically the definition of that intent, that end-to-end intent, right? And based on that end-to-end intent, we will drive some relationships at the control and data plane for connectivity to actually be realized across these domains, right? So it includes not just connectivity between data centers and campus and WAN, but also connectivity to the appropriate firewalls and other elements, right? So the first step in the journey of creating that common tier of information is very simple. We simply exchange information on identity. So each domain has created their identities. We exchange the information on the groups that have been authenticated in the access network and the groups that have been created in the data center, on the data center side. Now, each domain now has full knowledge of all the groups, and each domain now is in a position where they can author individual policy, right? So we've federated the identity. When you look at cloud, basically the hope is you can federate identity immediately without making much change, rather than trying to influence how AWS or anybody else does things internally. All we need is the front-end information of the applications that are there. Then we can basically create our own policy in the access network, right? For a domain like ACI, you could have policies on both sides, right? So now you have independent policies. I can define a QoS policy on the access network. Maybe a QoS policy doesn't really bear much relevance on the data center side because I have so much bandwidth. So I can define contracts that define who can talk to what inside the data center and enforce it only there. That might be my way of operating, right? So first step, identity exchange and independent policy domains, right? Now, one example of this is basically what we do right now. This is shipping. We exchange information between ICE and APIC, right? ICE on the access controls on the access side and APIC on the data center side. We basically exchange not just the names of the groups, but which IP addresses belong to those groups. And this is important because there are domains that don't necessarily understand groups, right? As Sean explained, we actually have a rendering of groups onto the data plane. Not all domains are going to have that, right? So I exchange a mapping of I exchange the information not of just the groups, but also the IP addresses that map to those groups, right? So I do that bidirectionally. Now, both sides have all the list of groups and they know which IP addresses belong to those groups. What they do with that is up to the individual systems, right? So I can actually push that and explode it into a large IP ACL, or if I have security group ACL capabilities, I can basically keep it concise in the data plane as security group ACLs, right? So that's basically what we do here, and you can see that there's a stitching of the data plane where I have tag traffic come to the border of one domain. I take the tags off, send it in the clear, and I reclassify based on the information that I had where I knew which IP addresses belonged to which groups, right? And then I can apply policy independently on both, on either side, right? Okay. So basically this is something that is already in flight, and this is the first instantiation of this identity federation, right? Where we want to eventually get is to be able to federate the policy across the domain. So if I create a policy here, right, I need to basically be able to publish it to a common repository so that everybody is in sync. Because what can easily happen here is you can basically have one domain step on the toes of the other, right? You do not want to necessarily have an environment where you have to centralize everything, although that is the intermediate step that we do take, right? So in an environment, before we get to the federation of not just the identity, but the identity plus the policies themselves, before we get to that point, there is a point where, an intermediate point, where if we start down here at the federation of identity, and then we want to get to the federation of policy plus identity, in the middle, when we're just federated identity and the domains remain independent for policy enforcement and policy definition, I can actually orchestrate this. So if I have an orchestrator that can talk to both domains, then I can basically drive through APIs the behavior that I want on either side and make it consistent. They're still independent domains, but I'm driving it from a central orchestrator, right? So this is the intermediate step until we get to a place where it doesn't matter where you author the policy from, you would actually be able to make sure that it is consistent across, and which is a true federation, right? The federation is interesting because you can now have owners of resources define what kind of policy they would like to entertain in the form of a catalog, right? And if you saw the policy that we suggested, there were two ends to it. There was a provider and a consumer. So you can provide half of the policy and expose it out there for consumption in an asynchronous manner. So now you can create catalogs and have people consume them, right? So that's eventually where we want to get with the federation. In the meantime, we're basically in an environment where you can have Cisco firewalls, third-party firewalls as a security domain that may be basically wedged between the access network and the data center. You will have data center environments, not just Cisco data center environments, but cloud data center environments, right? We will basically be exchanging identity information between them, and there are tools that are commonly used tools that actually can actually orchestrate the policy that we're using. So these are some of the things that you can actually see demos of here at the show, where we have basically all domains being policy capable, being able to actually enforce these access control, QoS, and path optimization policies, and have it basically be driven from a central orchestrator and get coherence of policy end to end. That's basically where we're headed, and largely this is where we're at right now. And you can see how we get basically the normalization of the intent across all of these different domains. And we can now be effective in realizing that intent. So not just a marketing tagline, not just network period intuitive, but it's actually something that can actually be acted upon. Right? So some of the things that you'll see is basically from the access network perspective, where do you enforce policy? Well, as I go towards private data centers or public clouds, I can basically spread my enforcement points out to those sites. You will also see that we are proposing the centralization of that, right? So instead of having policy enforcement points distributed to every data center location, maybe I can actually centralize that to a carrier-neutral facility. Same exact model, same exact considerations. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we're not trying to get into the cloud and alter their policies. We're not even trying to understand the policies and interrelationships between servers, right? That's a separate problem. If you think about it, You'll see in the container networking space a lot of detail where endpoints don't necessarily get identified by just an IP address, but now an IP address gets used by a multitude of endpoints, right? That's a problem that doesn't manifest itself at the front end of the application, and therefore something that for the cross-domain purposes of the intent that we're manifesting here, it gets basically masked, right? So just wanted to make that note there so that it's clear that that's basically not where we're trying to target this. It can be a little bit confusing because that's where in the data center the conversation's always been about relationships between application tiers, right? And it's based on intent and it's based on group relationships, right? What we're talking about is once you have that full application baked, how do I actually create intent between the user groups and the applications themselves, the front end of the applications. Okay?